Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Once Upon a Time in Washington, D.C. could be considered a calling card for George Pelecanos' one-of-a-kind career and catalog, largely based there, with NPR noting that as an author, he's known for his deep well of stories set in the streets of Washington, D.C., while the New York Times once mused that if I were in jail, George Pelecanos would be on my reading list, right up there with James Lee Burke and Elmore Leonard. Pelecanos' characters are so human and so doomed. This is an author who writes with the steady hand of a man who knows he's driving a cool set of wheels and respects his own mechanical skills. A set that, in the esteemed opinion of the Times London, virtually guarantees that Pelecanos is incapable of writing a book that isn't gripping, and the dialogue is of a brilliance comparable only with Elmore Leonard or George V. Higgins. Stephen King has gone as far as calling him perhaps the greatest living American crime writer, while acclaimed novelist Dennis Lehane has mused that every time I read one of George's novels, I'm left a little awed. The guy's a national treasure. And beginning with his Nick Stephanos trilogy, Over a Firing Offense, Nick's Trip, and Down by the River Where the Dead Men Go, the Washington Post had already concluded he was writing contemporary classics. The Big Blowdown, which launched his celebrated DC quartet, inspired Esquire to crown him the poet laureate of the DC crime world, and continued over King Suckerman, The Sweet Forever, and Shame the Devil, where GQ admired his achieving a balance where all elements of a typical hard-boiled crime novel are here. But Pelecanos' character-driven plot shows that noir doesn't have to be a shop-worn style, ready for the parody bin. USA Today would congratulate him on creating a tremendously powerful protagonist. The late great Elmore Leonard would pay him the high compliment of creating a terrific series full of characters I wish I'd thought of, in ex-cops turned PI Derek Strange and Terry Quinn, who crack cases together over Right as Rain, which People magazine complimented along the way for vividly portraying the nuances of racial tension, the territorial braggadocio of cops and pushers, and youthful slang. Hell to Pay, Soul Circus, Hard Revolution, and What It Was, which moved the New York Times to credit Pelecanos as being pivotal in reinventing the traditional gumshoe story for streetwise settings and more socially conscious times, without losing that genre's entertainment value. Mr. Pelecanos, whose work gets better and better, continues to ascribe motives more wrenching than random ugliness to perpetrators whose lives have gone wrong. Spero Lucas would next entertain fans beginning in The Cut, which the Wall Street Journal complimented as a lean, swift, atmospheric detective novel, along with sequel The Double, with the Washington Post calling Lucas very good company, along other celebrated standalones like Shoe Dog, Drama City, The Night Gardener, The Turnaround, The Way Home, and The Man Who Came Uptown. Pelecanos' gifts as a short story master were highlighted with the Associated Press reverie of Owning Up, where they found as usual that the writing is taut, the violence is graphic, and the characters are so well drawn that they step off the page and into your life. As good as it gets. The Washington City paper took an immediate liking as readers did to his more recent release, Buster a Dog, observing that it encapsulates Pelecanos' themes regarding bad behavior and redemption, and references to DC streets like Georgia Avenue, but is told literally by a dog who grew up in a public housing complex. As he's equally celebrated for his other short story collections like The Dead Their Eyes Implore Us, The Martini Shot, and the graphic novel S6X, The Complete Graphic. Career-long fan National Public Radio, touring another wing of his creative gallery, has written that Pelecanos is known for his gritty, realistic crime stories. For television, he co-created The Deuce, about the burgeoning porn industry in the 1970s New York City, and We Own This City, a miniseries detailing a real-life corrupt police ring in Baltimore, and perhaps is most notably known for the 5 seasons he worked as a scriptwriter and producer on HBO's legendary The Wire, which Time magazine called irresistible, the Los Angeles Times crowned as genius, and where People magazine spotlighted a rare ability to illustrate the gray areas of city life. And he's here today to talk about it all. Mr. Pelecanos, welcome to the show. Now, we both share a deep love, like so many, of the late great Elmore Leonard's work. And beyond the king, you count some real heavy-hitting storytellers like Raymond Chandler, Ross MacDonald, and the great Mickey Spillane, among others, as influences on you growing up. And like the so many kids that grew up in the last 25 years watching and influenced by HBO's The Wire, which you were a principal writer on, do you count both books and TV and film as influences that shaped you as a storyteller?
For me, it was movies, initially, and I'm still a movie freak. I run a series over at the American Film Institute here in Silver Spring on Friday nights, and where I introduce the films, and that's my first love still. So the answer is, as a child in the '60s, before I became a teenager, it was, the films of John Sturges, Sergio Leone, Robert Aldrich, and then probably most influential was the Wild Bunch. When my dad took me to see the Wild Bunch, and I walked out of that theater, and I sort of knew what I wanted to do with my life. But of course, I didn't understand what that meant. I just wanted to make movies and write movies, and then when I got to college at the University of Maryland, so I wasn't much of a reader, although I read the newspaper every day, and that's how I learned to write. Looking back on it, that's how I learned to organize my thoughts on paper, and specifically the Washington Post. But when I got to college, I took this elective class in my senior year on crime fiction. Teacher was Charles C. Mish, and he turned me on to books and crime fiction. And we read the greats, we read Chandler and Hammett and Ross McDonald, John D. McDonald, even Mickey Spillane was on the syllabus. And it changed my ambition. I then decided that I wanted to write books, and with the back of my mind was that if I made all of this is conjecture, right? It was being naive and everything, not knowing anything. It was like if I become a published author, Hollywood's going to come to me, and that's how I'm going to get in there. And that's what happened. I mean, not knowing anything, that's really what happened.
You've highlighted Charles Mish at the University of Maryland as a professor who really first piqued your interest in books. Who else do you count, either before that point or through the rest of college, that served in the role of mentor or influence as your writing craft evolved?
I sort of went to these kind of blue collar public schools, and I don't remember even ever meeting with a counselor or anything. But I did have a couple teachers that would say to me, you're a pretty good writer, you should pursue it. I didn't know what that meant or how to do it. When I went to the University of Maryland, I majored in journalism. I thought I'd be a newspaper guy, but it was too structured for me. And then I moved over to radio, television, and film, the film division, which at that time at Maryland, you actually made films. And I kind of found my tribe there, a group of students that were all doing the same thing. And that's what kept me, that and film theory classes, that's what kept me in college, because I really didn't like college, but that kept me interested. And when I started reading the books, there were quite a few that stood out. You mentioned Elmore Leonard. I think that he's a hero to all of us of my generation. He showed us that you could contemporize the crime novel and write it in a different way than what had come before. And I would add Crumley to the mix. The Last Good Kiss, Dancing Bear, those books. A book that really blew me away was The Deep Blue Goodbye, John D. MacDonald. I think that's a book that stands the test of time. These are the guys that I sort of emulated.
As have yours. Traveling back to 1992 when we first meet Nick Stephanos in A Firing Offense, which the Washington Post congratulated on the novel's cover as a contemporary classic, full of virtuoso scenes, suspenseful action, and brooding meditation on a newly lost generation, which then continued over your first successful series via sequels Nick's Trip and Down by the River Where the Dead Men Go. Why did it feel right to you to set the series in your hometown of Washington, D.C., which notably will become a signature of your work to come?
I wanted to do something different, and growing up here, I wanted to write about Washington because it had up to that time, it had not been written about in that way, meaning everyday Washingtonians, working class, people who have been here for generations, come up from the South. There were no books about it. And that's what I set out to do. That's the first thing I ever tried to write, was my first novel. I'd never written a short story, anything. I just thought, again, naively, I thought I could do it. And the first person thing was, I would say, looking back on it now, it's sort of a crutch, right? It's a little bit easier to write in the first person. and it's also in the traditional mystery novel. It the reader discovers the events and the solution to the crime as it's written, as because the protagonist is discovering it at the same time. So it seemed to be an easier way to get in, not knowing how to write a novel at all, not having any mentors or never taken a writing class. I just did it. And the one thing I want to bring up, because you're a musician, you'll understand this, is that, I was a punk rock fan at the time and earlier. And it was very inspirational for me to draw from that ethos, meaning I would look at those DC bands, the famous ones and the not so famous ones. So I'd go out and see a lot of music. And it inspired me because they were not professional musicians. And my way of thinking was that, okay, I'm not a writer, no writing class, no pedigree, nothing, but maybe I can do it too, pick up a guitar and play, right? I mean, why not? And that's what I did. I wrote my first book in longhand and notebooks. I then wrote it again in another set of notebooks. And then I bought a computer and I wrote it a third time and I sent it up to New York blindly to one publisher because they were publishing a lot of crime novels. And then I didn't hear back from them for a year. And in that year, I started writing another book, Nick's Trip. A year after I sent it up, I got a call on my answering machine saying, "We just picked your book up off the slush pile and we want to buy it." That's how I got published. And really, all I wanted was to write one book and to have my name on the spine of a book in a store or a library. And when I got that call, it was, the expression walking on air. That's what it felt like. I knew that it was something that no matter what happened in my life after that, something that couldn't get taken away from me. Um, and I didn't have any plans to have a career at this or anything like that. That's all I wanted was that one book. But I found that I liked the process so much that I kept writing. And there I was on my way. Within those books, I think the third book I wrote, that was my first book that was third person, had a lot of different points of view. And so I figured it out and I knew I could do it. And then after the third Nick Stephanos, I wrote just sort of my Once Upon a Time in DC.
The Big Blowdown and the educated opinion of the Washingtonian would crown you following the release of this novel as arguably the most popular working Washington novelist, the rare writer who can conjure convincing characters from across the racial chasm. Less remarked upon, set in a variety of periods, Pelecanos' work represents something of a cultural history of hometown DC. A sampling from the Big Blowdown spans the decade and a half after World War II, as Washington becomes America's first black majority big city. Please reflect, if you would, on what it was like making that rise with characters as original as these to keep you company on the page.
Some of it is a thinly veiled story of my dad, who was born in Greece, lived in Chinatown when he was a kid, which is where all the poorest immigrants lived. And then he he joined the Marine Corps and fought in the Pacific in World War II. And when he came back, he married my mother and he was straight. But when Peter Karras comes back, he comes back from the war and everything goes bad for him. I was in danger of, well, let me say this. I'm really grateful to my editor at St. Martin's Press, Gordon Van Gelder. He bought my first book. He shepherded all 5 books there. Really good editor and a good friend. But I had to leave St. Martin's because they weren't doing anything but selling my books to the libraries. And also I wasn't making any money. Like, believe it or not, the first 5 books, my advances range from $2,500 to $5,000. Those are my advances. And I was working 2 jobs at the time, and I was starting to have kids, my wife and I. There was a point where I was going to have to walk away from it because working 2 jobs and having children, young children, coming home at night from my day job and working in a room by myself. It just wasn't for that kind of money. It just wasn't working out. And my agent Sloan Harris moved me to Little Brown, and I've been there ever since. 17 novels, and that changed my career and my life.
Once the famed DC Quartet had launched, fans were riveted throughout sequels like King's Suckerman, which Time Out promised had jive, juice, and a whole lot of justice. The Sweet Forever and Shame the Devil, where the iconic Village voice admired the way through which, by taking your time, by working seemingly tangential subplots smoothly into the main story, Pelecanos finds an extra layer of resonance. This novel dares to escape the genre straitjacket and defer its violence to just before the point of endurance. It's a thriller with an ethnic accent, brains, balls, and everything in between. What did you most enjoy about starring these different eras in the District of Columbia's social and local history throughout the series with Pete Karras and others as their characters were shaped by the times?
I started to think at that point, I'm gonna write a history of Washington in the 20th century, and that's where it would start with the big blowdown, because that book starts in the 20s. That was the idea, and that propelled me into King Suckerman, which was the son of Peter Karras in 1976. And what really turned me on about that, the idea of it was, you had this guy in the big blowdown who was, wore a fedora and overcoats, and then you had his son was ripped jeans, long hair, selling weed. And it's only what, 30 years later, right? Like the city had changed and the culture had changed radically. Um, and I just kept going with it. And you bring it up to the present with these characters, and you've got this sort of panoramic look at the city. I still do this. I've done it in my most recent book, Owning Up. I find a historical event that is significant, and I put the characters there, and they're not. James Elroy talks about his powerful white men who changed the course of history. These are characters um, who are not those kinds of characters. They can't change. They can't change the world. They can't change history. They're working class people. They go to work every day while these things are happening around them. And so the bicentennial was what I wanted to do with King Suckerman. I wrote it around that. The Sweet Forever is the death of Len Bias, which was a big thing here, as you know.
With ex-cops turned PIs Derek Strange and Terry Quinn, you would continue to carve out your own unique niche within crime fiction over Right as Rain, Hell to Pay, Soul Circus, Hard Revolution, and What It Was, where the New York Times would credit you throughout the series with being pivotal in reinventing the traditional gumshoe story for streetwise settings and more socially conscious times without losing the genre's entertainment value. Mr. Pelecanos' Washington-based Derek Strange, in particular, has become a charismatic figure in this landscape, a sharp, affectionately drawn private investigator. Strange, whose shingle reads Strange Investigations, digs thoughtfully into each case. Mr. Pelecanos, whose work gets better and better, continues to ascribe motives more wrenching than random ugliness to perpetrators whose lives have gone wrong. Please give viewers a glimpse of the world as seen through those sets of detectives' eyes as they sought justice together for voiceless victims throughout the series' wildly successful run.
Derek Strange is my favorite character. I've written more books about him than any other character, and I just like the guy. I like he's a composite of a certain kind of black man that I knew growing up here in town who had, a lot, physically strong, a lot of dignity, ex-athlete, and of course he leaves the force very young at 22 years old after the 68 riots, and we take him forward as an investigator. But the very first book, Right as Rain, is he joins up with a guy who's left the force under a cloud after a police shooting, and that's Quinn. And I put them together, and it started to crackle, man. I mean, it really started to pop. And look, I haven't said this yet, but I don't outline anything. I just write. And I knew that as far as the wrong shooting went, there was a spate of them at the time where police there was several shootings where police had shot other cops, and a lot of it had to do with it went over from the weapon, the sidearm of the MPD went over from a 38 to a Glock 17, and the Glock 17 had a very light trigger pull, no external safety. They were having accidents with these guns, but the idea was that and this had happened actually. Is a black cop in a street clothes had walked onto a crime scene and was shot by a policeman who thought he was a perpetrator. And it actually happened up in Boston too. There's a very good book called The Fence about a situation like that where these white cops beat the shit out of this black guy who was at a crime scene, and it turned out he was a cop. And so anyway, that's where it started, and I just wrote the book, and the chemistry was there, and I continued with three books with those two. It gave me an engine, a narrative engine, and then just to have these guys interact. It was important to me to have Strange be not just be a PI, but to have a business with a storefront on Georgia Avenue down at 9th and Upshur, because he was, well, first of all, he's coaching football to kids, peewee football, and he has a lot of relationships with those kids who look up to him. And then for them to see him turn the key on his own business every day, right on the very visible Georgia Avenue, was really important. He was showing them that this is what a man does. He goes to work every day. And so all those things played into it. And they helped me with his character. Hard Revolution was the 68 riots, which is something I always wanted to write about, but I waited until my 12th novel when I felt like I had the chops to do it. And keep in mind that all of this stuff is heavily researched. I mean, I'm sitting in my office right now. I could show you my files they're stuffed with information. And this is all, I don't have a researcher. I go out and do all this stuff myself, not just library work, but I go out and find people who lived through this, and I talk to them. I do oral histories, and then the story unfolds for me like that.
Time magazine promised it was irresistible, and the Baltimore Sun would correctly declare when The Wire first began airing on HBO that there was little precedence within television history for the rich portrayal of working class life as depicted by The Wire, while USA Today argued that the show's ability to create a believable sense of place is nothing short of astounding. TV of the highest order, while Variety crowned it sophisticated and significant television. Please take the generations of fans of this show around the world, which many argue is the best TV show of all time, back in time to how you and co-creators David Simon and Ed Burns first teamed up to co-create this masterpiece.
We didn't know each other. He went to BCC. I went to Northwood. As you know, growing up around here, it's two different cultures, even though it's just 3 or 4 miles apart, right? But I knew his girlfriend and later become his wife, Laura Lippman, a fantastic novelist out of Baltimore, and she handed him one of my books when he was starting get The Wire going, and it was A Sweet Forever, which is sort of a very deep urban novel about city problems and police and drug dealers and that kind of thing, and it was very similar to what he was doing in Baltimore, what I was writing about in Washington. So we had a mutual friend who died, and I went to the funeral. He was there, and he says, "Ride with me back to the Shiva." And in the car, he told me about the show he just sold to HBO, and he didn't oversell it. He said, "It's about cops and drug dealers in Baltimore." He didn't say it's about America and all that lofty stuff. And he says, "Do you want to write an episode for me?" So yeah, I do. So he gave me an episode in season 1. Turned out to be sort of a notorious episode because it's the death of Wallace, and killed by his friends, and people really liked what I did, and he brought me on second season as a story editor and producer. I worked on the show all 5 years. I did what I always do. I go out there, and yes, I talk to people, and I get in with the police. It was easy. it was easy in Baltimore to get in with the police, much easier than it was in Washington in terms of just riding with police in a casual way, going out on bus, that kind of thing. I'd already written a lot of books about how the drug game works in the city, so I had that knowledge. Um, what I had to do was figure out Baltimore because even though it's only 45 minutes away, it's a completely different culture and language and so on. And I feel like you have to get engaged. When I did Treme down in New Orleans, as soon as I went down there, I started going out at night and just it's as simple as sitting in a bar and having a beer and just listening to people talk. It's not being so much being gregarious and injecting myself into conversations. It's just listening. I've been doing that my whole life. When I worked for my dad, he had a diner downtown. I used to ride the bus down Georgia Avenue and then transfer on to the F Street bus, DC Transit. And I would just listen to people. I didn't know I was going to be a writer, but I was interested, and I still am.
If you'll kindly delve with us cult fans a bit, please talk about writing from the perspective of Detective Jimmy McNulty, many people's favorite cop on the show.
McNulty was the David Simon character in the show. He had, I mean, David had embedded himself with the police in Baltimore, so he wrote the book Homicide, which is still the Bible for people who want to know how that division works in the city. And David had, had some things in his personal life that he injected into the character, and but in general, I would say we had a fantastic writers' room on that show.
We'd love if you'd take us inside that writing laboratory for a moment.
We met every day, which is kind of unusual during the season, and it was a lot of different perspectives. You had people, Ed Burns was a cop for 25 years. He was a teacher in the public school system, Vietnam veteran. Richard Price, brings a fantastic amount of information into the room, and he's a big time researcher. Dennis Lehane, and so and I had been writing books for a long time set in Washington, on the other side of Washington. So there was all these people that had all this different kinds of experience, and we all thought we were the best writer in the room, which is as it should be, you know. And very competitive, a lot of argument. Some of it wasn't friendly argument, but it was fertile ground for producing that show because we fought it out every day, and all those different perspectives and all that argument is what made it good ultimately, in my opinion. There was different times during the series where somebody would bring in an idea and then we would run with it, and that was a case of them having the foresight. If you remember, Bunny Colvin shows up in the previous season at the end of an episode, and you don't even know who he is, and that was David saying, look at this guy because he's coming next season. And he already knew, we knew what seasons were going to be about. We knew that season 3 was going to be about the legalization of drugs. We knew that season 4 was going to be about kids. So we always had that in the back of our minds. The thing about the Amsterdam scene where they've got these kids and they're shaking them down and they say, you got to go over to Amsterdam. And when I wrote that, I was just trying to get out of the scene. Like, you always try to figure out a button for the scene. And I thought, well, this kid's has no reference of Amsterdam, right? In the Netherlands, he just doesn't know what that is. So he hears the word and he goes, I ain't going to no Amsterdam. And it was just a joke to get us out of the scene, but it turned into something. Now you see people wearing T-shirts with Amsterdam on.
What about in contrast to McNulty or Rawls, taking on the more potentially complex character territory of a Stringer Bell, Avon Barksdale, or even say Omar Little?
We didn't really come at it from a perspective of okay, these guys are drug dealers. What are they gonna say? What are they gonna do? Um, Idris Stringer Bell was a character who had ambitions to move on from that, and um, Barksdale was more street and wanted to stay that way. Um, and after a while, the it's just like writing a book. After a while, the characters take on a life of their own based on how you've created them. It's not magic, but based on how you've created them, they start talking to you and doing things that they would do based on what they are as a person, as a human being, and then it starts to write itself. And the other thing that I would say that might be of interest is that it it gets a lot easier to write that show in particular if you were there every day, which I was, meaning I was on set every day. I was interacting with the actors. I was learning production. And when you have that knowledge, it's much easier to write than it is if you're writing from your office at home and sending in a script. To me, it doesn't work. Um, there are so many television shows, and when I watch them, I can tell you if the creator and the writer producers were there or not, or if they were just, you've got these people now that have 3 or 4 shows on the air at the same time. And let me tell you something, it shows in the quality because you got to be there every day. I would never do more than one project at a time. I want to laser focus on the show when I'm making it, be there call to wrap every day, be in prep, be in post, all that stuff. That's how you make a show successfully.
Now, so many future big time TV and movie stars came out of this cast as unknowns. From Dominic West to Wendell Pierce as Bunk, to Idris Elba as Stringer, Wood Harris as Avon, and Michael B. Jordan as Wallace from the Creed franchise. Lance Reddick as Daniels, who'd go on to be in the John Wick franchise and play Chief Irv Irving on Bosch, alongside another Bosch alumni, J. Edgar and Jamie Hector, who of course played Marlo Stanfield to chilling effect. Would you give fans of the show a sense of how key casting decisions for pivotal characters like these worked?
My recollection with Jamie is that we were looking at the work of a director, a guy named Seath Mann, really good guy, and went to Springbrook, by the way. He's from here, and he had made a short, and Jamie was starring in the short, and it might have been a student film. I don't remember what it was, but it was really good. And that's where we first saw Jamie, and we brought him in to read. Um, and Jamie's really, you didn't mention it, but he was in We Own the City, also our show. He had a major role in that, and we always like to bring actors back if we can who we enjoy working with, and not just but do a great job. He's a really good actor.
LA Weekly would declare by the end of the show's 5-season run that in totality it was vibrant, masterful work of art and the best show on television, while Entertainment Weekly agreed that it was the best show on TV, period, and TV Guide proclaimed it to be as great as modern literature. What were you proudest of within this once-in-television history phenomena you helped create with The Wire?
I wish we had 6, but we wanted to do immigration into the city and the Latino population that was starting to blow up at the time. And we couldn't get that 6th season. But one thing people don't realize is that, or they forget, is that The Wire was not a big hit when it was on the air. And we always had to grovel a little bit to get more work. So we were lucky to get 5, I think. To their credit, they it was not big in the ratings, but they recognized that it was sort of important. And also on the business tip, it was good for their brand. They didn't have a show like that on HBO, um, and they haven't had since. So yeah, I mean, I just remember everybody was pretty tired by the end. That was a tough show to make, man. There was a lot of night shoots, and were you up all night, and then I would drive back to Washington. I had a 2-hour commute on that show. I didn't stay up there because I wanted to see my kids. Um, so my days were always always 14 hours and sometimes 16 or 18-hour days. And so to answer your question, we were tired. And we created something that was lightning in a bottle. I mean, we didn't know it was going to be The Wire, like we were just trying to get it done, and that's what came out of there. It was a once in a lifetime thing.
You would thereafter continue your successful partnership with HBO over new series like Treme, set in New Orleans, The Deuce, set in 1970s New York City, and We Own the City, based once again in Baltimore. How thrilling has it remained for you and David Simon to continue to co-create on these different visual canvases together?
We thought of it as a coda to The Wire, and because 20 years have passed now since we started that show. 22 years. We started in 2002, and but we didn't want to do a Wire 2. And again, we had this excellent event happen that excellent for us as writers. Um, the arrest and conviction of this squad of police officers in Baltimore who got sent up to federal prison for uh, all kinds of corruption. And but it wasn't. It, I didn't want to make a show about dirty cops, and I wanted to give these guys their voice too, which we did. And I'm really proud of the fact that we let them speak. There's a couple of scenes where the worst of these guys is talking to the woman who's investigating him, and she says, you've got 47 complaints against you for of physical abuse and so on. And he says, who doesn't get what a cop who doesn't get complaints is a cop who doesn't get out of his car. And that's true. And this guy did what he did, but he's right. After Freddie Gray, a lot of cops in Baltimore just stayed in their car because the Freddie Gray case, look, those guys that were involved in the murder of Freddie Gray, in the death of Freddie Gray, however you want to put it, should have been kicked off the force. But instead, and then they wouldn't be cops anymore. But instead they were over prosecuted, and they didn't get convicted of anything, and they're still police for the most part. But what it did was other cops said, well, if I'm going to get charged every time somebody bumps their head or something like that, getting into a car, I'm just not going to get out of my squad car. And that's what happened. I mean, the numbers are illustrative of that. Post Freddie Gray, arrests went down big time in Baltimore. So we want to write about all those things, and also how the quest for numbers, the quest for having arrests, the political connection to that. You have politicians that are, the mayor of Baltimore, not now, Brendan Scott's a good mayor, but back then when all this happened, and going back to the early aughts, you had the mayor that wanted to be the governor and eventually wanted to be the president. So the year he was running, and this is true, there were 100,000 arrests in Baltimore. Okay, he got his numbers. Out of those 100,000 arrests, there were very few convictions because most of them were bullshit arrests. It was all about getting the numbers. They never even went to trial for the most part, but they got their numbers. So all these things are connected. And then the drug war again, which messed up everything. Yeah, I was really lucky to be involved in that and be able to live in New Orleans for 3 years. And I had fun, man. I mean, it was so fun to live there and work there. Best music in the world, best food in the world. Just a wonderful place. There's nothing like it in America. And then I got to live in New York for a few years too when I did The Deuce, which is something that I never got to do when I was younger. And that was fantastic. That was a lot of fun.
Amid all of that amazing creative output, you would continue to prolifically produce standalone hits like Drama City, where CBS News promised fans of Washington, D.C. crime writer George Pelecanos get what they've been waiting for, and more with his latest book, and introduce us to a new protagonist, who after serving 8 years in prison, Lorenzo Brown goes from drug dealer to dog catcher, hoping to lead a straight life, but facing temptations along the way. What has intrigued you time and again to focus on characters trying to succeed at transitioning from prison back into society? Say Cuddy in The Wire, for instance, or here with Lorenzo. in a story that you notably tell from both the ex-prisoner and his probation officer's points of view.
I've written about it many times, and uh, you know, for about 20, maybe 25 years, I've been working with incarcerated people, doing writing and reading programs. And I go down to the DC jail. Um, and so I got interested in that because you get to know some of these guys, and you have a lot of empathy for them, what they're going to face when they come out, when they come uptown. And so there was that aspect of it. And then with Drama City, I thought, well, what if what would a guy do? Because you can't, it's hard to get hired when you come out. And I just had the idea. I went down to the Humane Society at Georgia and Geranium, and I talked to the people there, and I said, would you hire a guy coming out of prison to be a Humane Society enforcement officer, what they call dog police? And the woman there said, yeah, I would, unless they were, you know, a murderer or a rapist. And so uh, I had Lorenzo coming out he was in on drug charges. And then I embedded myself with the Humane Society people, and I went out with them, and we did a lot of work out on the street. And this was during the dogfighting craze. So there was a lot to write about. And I was a younger dude too, so I could do the physical shit, like, you know, jump fences and pick up dogs and, you know, take dogs away from people. There was conflict when you're taking somebody's dog away. It was all really interesting to me. And I knew, as far as Rachel goes, I knew a probation officer, a friend of mine, and I rode with her and went around to her stops, visiting with people and that kind of thing. And just that's how you build a world.
You would then extend this study within the framework of the story told within The Man Who Came from Uptown. Except here it takes on Elmore Leonard-esque proportions as he joins up with a PI and ex-cop to be their getaway driver as they rob criminals. Where did you develop this unique angle to look at that same struggle through?
It began with just having my ear to the street and hearing about ex-cops who were robbing drug dealers, and not just drug dealers, but anybody with money. So I think in the book, the first guy they rob is a pimp, and it's anybody who they think deserves to get got. You know what I mean? And that's where that came from. It was based on some stuff that was happening out in the street at the time. But the main character is a guy the Man Who Came Uptown is my love letter to books and reading. It's sort of my way of giving back to how my life turned out because of storytelling and books. And you know, because I was in some trouble when I was younger, and I was kind of rudderless for a while, let's say. And you know, reading and writing turned my whole life around. So this guy who was not much of a reader, like I wasn't, is down in the DC jail, and he gets turned on to books by the librarian down there. And I met the librarian, who was a woman, a very extraordinary person, who at the time, before they had built a library in the DC jail, used to go around on a cart every day to different cell blocks, and she would recommend books to inmates. They would stand in the line, and she'd say, I think you like this, Bob, or Larry, you know, check this out, Elmore Leonard Valdez is coming. And this guy falls in love with books, and all he wants to do when he gets out is have a job. He gets a job as a dishwasher in a restaurant, and get a library card. And you know, his idea of heaven is a bag of weed and a library card. And he just wants to be left alone to do that, and um, lead a life of just enjoying life in that way. But of course, he gets sucked into something by the guy who got him out, and therein lies the conflict.
The Associated Press promised readers that The Night Gardener can be read as a police procedural, hipper but just as good as those of the late great Ed McBain. But it's also a wise, textured examination of life in urban America. Before doubling down that Pelecanos' last book, Drama City, is a masterpiece of American crime fiction, before adding that The Night Gardener's even better. Is it true that this story was in part inspired by a real life case of a serial killer preying upon urban victims?
Yeah, the Freeway Phantom case in Washington in the 70s. It was, I believe, 8 girls were killed. Um, they were varying ages, let's say 14 to 18, but they all looked to be about the same age. They were they were redressed when they were found, so it was very hard to do any DNA work on them. And some were found dumped on the highways around here, so it became known as the Freeway Phantom. But it's been sort of forgotten. They never found the killer. It's been a little bit forgotten, and I think it's because the girls were all black and they were all from most of them were from southeast and northeast, and it's just been for unjustly forgotten, and I wanted to write about it. And specifically, it's my only serial killer novel. I don't really like serial killer novels, so I tried to avoid the traps of that. Meaning, it's not a very it's not graphically violent at all. You don't really read about what specifically happened to these kids. You don't go into the mind of the serial killer with italicized chapters and all that stuff. I'm not interested in that. I was interested in what it did to the police who couldn't solve it. And and that's the perspective I took on it. And I wanted to memorialize these girls because they've been forgotten.
With the turnaround on the way home, as you continued to weave standalone stories within your series worlds, what did you find to be to your advantage in creating on those canvases of not having to be part of a connected collection, so to speak, in contrast to writing within a series?
With the exception of Strange, I think I've written 5 novels with Strange. It's been my limit. Most of the other books, the Terry Quinn novels, I wrote 2 of those, Stephanos 3. I don't want to. I know the later books aren't going to be as good as the early books. I know it, and I don't want to do that to the people who buy my books or even just get them out of the library. I just don't want to do that to people. I want every book to be as good as I can write it. Sometimes I fail, but that's my ambition. Is always My ambition is always to be a better writer the next time, and the way to do that is to keep it fresh and to avoid that trap of writing 8 novels or 10 novels with the same character because it's going to get tired.
Speaking of series, your next recurring character would arrive with Spero Lucas, in what the Wall Street Journal found to be a lean, swift, atmospheric detective novel, with an engagingly layered character in Speros, and within the cut of resourceful and notably original work that delivers the thrills of an action movie and the poignancy of fine storytelling. While the double inspired longtime fan of the Washington Post to observe that Pelecanos clearly knows that he's in the business of entertainment, and he goes about it in a thoroughly professional way. But entertainment needn't be the end in itself. A book that entertains can also enrich, instruct, and even enlighten. George Pelecanos' books do all of that. Please discuss within creating Spero Lucas what specifically interested you about PTSD to make it and all that veterans go through coming home from war a co-star in this duology.
That was at a time when a lot of people, men and women, were coming back from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I had done some stuff at the old Walter Reed on George Avenue. I'd gone down there and talked to veterans and done some reading stuff with them. And I got interested in that. And what about a guy who came back, was not injured, but was injured mentally, uh, PTSD, but doesn't admit it and likes the action? Because I found that a lot of these guys, the reason they become cops and security guards and stuff like that is they miss it in a sense. Even though war is and can be horrible, it can also be exhilarating to a young man or woman. And to come back and not have that exhilaration anymore and also not have a mission. Because when you're in the military, every morning you get up and somebody tells you that this is what we're doing today. So I thought this guy would come back and take cases. And of course, his percentage of finding lost things is a direct nod to Travis McGee and John D. McDonald, who Travis McGee used to take half and half of what he found. And I think Spero Lucas takes 40%, his cut.
The Los Angeles Times mused of your recent release, Owning Up, that here we see what makes Pelecanos' best writing so resonant: the sense of longing, of miscommunication, the way love does not enlarge us but rather makes us small. And when you cover every topical territory here, from the 1919 Washington, D.C. race riots to no-knock warrants, please talk a bit about what inspired these four new moving tales contained within this short story collection.
I had a couple things that were sort of in the hopper. I had started a novel, a big novel set between 1919 and 1923, about a dozen years ago, and I put it away after one chapter. It was the chapter was good, but I didn't think I could sustain it for a novel. But then I got into the file and I saw that when my mom was alive, I had done interviews with her about that, about the 20s, and I saw she had written some stuff for me in her handwriting. And then I decided I wanted to complete it for her. And but so I figured a way out to do it in a novella, which is a young woman in the 80s wants to write a novel. She goes around and finds these old people who lived through that era, and she does some oral history work with them, and they tell their story. And again, it's framed around two historical events: the 1919 riots in D.C., which most people don't know about. They're not really riots; it was a race war for 3 or 4 days in Washington. And then in 1923, the collapse of the Knickerbocker Theater down at 18th and Columbia Road after a snowstorm. The roof caved in and killed almost 100 people. That was that. The no-knock was based on something that happened to my family, a no-knock warrant that was executed on my house 15 years ago that I wanted to write about, but I needed time to pass before I could do so the right way. And I needed my son, who was involved in a crime, I needed him to um, come out of it to the degree that I could write about it comfortably. He's a successful filmmaker, and he's in the DGA, and he's doing all kinds of good work in my business. Um, and then the other two books, one of the title story is centered around the Hanafi Muslim takeover of the city in 1977. They went into the B'nai B'rith building and also the city building, and they held a lot of hostages and so on. But it's really about a kid my age. It's autobiographical, very autobiographical, about what my life was like in the 70s as a kid growing up around here. Um, and the first one, The Amusement Machine, is about a couple guys in the DC jail who meet two very different people. One of them just is a ne'er-do-well, grew up privileged in Washington but can't get out of his own way. And the other guy is a guy who wants to be an actor. He was locked up for the wrong reason. He gets out, and then they meet later on on a TV set in Baltimore. It's what happens to them. It was four books, four novellas that I didn't think could be novels, but I wanted to write them, and I took the opportunity during the pandemic to just go in and plow it out. The book is called Owning Up. There's the title novella, and then the No Knock, The Amusement Machine, and Knickerbocker are the other novellas in the collection. And they were published by Little Brown.
The Washington City paper wrote of another of your recent releases, Buster, a Dog, that eloquently encapsulates Pelecanos' themes regarding bad behavior and redemption. What was it like seeing the world through the eyes of a dog in this story?
My new novella is called Buster. Here, I'm going to show a picture because I really love the cover. Can you see that? it, it's a book about a dog's life from a puppy to his last days, written by the dog in his voice. And it's a puppy who starts out in a loving family in the projects, and then he has various owners and harrowing experiences, and a stay in a kill shelter, stay with a very bad owner, abusive owner, some good people he meets. It's his life. It's an unusual book, but it kind of stems from my interest going back to 2005 when I wrote Drama City. I've had a sort of an interest in what goes on in a dog's head. I'm looking forward to seeing what people think about that. It's something very different for me. That was published by Akashic Books, which Johnny Temple's a rocker from DC and very principled guy, and I'm love working with them.
What's coming up that your fans can look forward to reading or binge streaming next?
I've got a couple things I'm developing at HBO, and hopefully, they're in the vein of what I've done before. They're social justice things, and hopefully entertaining at the same time. So working on that.
If you were giving out advice to aspiring wordsmiths, what would be 2 or 3 keys to your 4 decades of success in the business you could share with us before we run?
To me, it's pretty simple. Read a lot, read all the time, live a full life, be engaged, and write every day. You can't be a runner unless you run every day. You can't. I mean, it's just common sense. You gotta keep. You can't work out once a week and expect to have a good body. You know what I mean? You gotta work out every day.
What drives you these days within the stories you tell, whether on the page or on the screen?
First of all, for me, it's fun. I like getting out there. The research part of it is what gets me stoked to write the book, right? But beyond that, my biggest fear on everything I do, and whether it's writing a novel or doing a TV show, is I'm always when I write my books, I'm writing for Washingtonians. When I did Treme, I was writing for New Orleanians, and same with the Deuce in New York. So, and with the Wire, it was always in the back of our minds. Everything we wrote, every scene was. I don't want somebody from Baltimore watching this show and saying that was bullshit. Okay, and I feel that way about everything I've done. I'm laser focused on that. It doesn't mean that I don't get it wrong sometimes or I don't make mistakes. I'm human. I do, but my goal is to not make those kinds of mistakes and have the viewer looking at the show or reading my book and saying that guy got it right.
So it sounds like that's the greatest reward for you at the end of the day, when the reader or reviewer says they got it right.
Yeah. I mean, I did a movie, DC Noir, in the city. Very few movies get shot here, and we did it 100% in the city, all 4 quadrants. And we were down at Park Morton, which is Petworth, and it's a community down there, and people were coming out of their houses and talking to us, and it was just very rewarding to talk to them and say, they might say like, "Oh, I read that book of yours, and you really got it right." Um, it's the most rewarding thing, because it's going to be there forever. It's a record.
Mr. Pelecanos, it's been an honor speaking today. Been a fan for a long time of your work. Thanks so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thanks, man.